Buchholz Plant Introductions, Part 8. I'm defining a Buchholz plant introduction as anything that was sold by me first, even those selections that were quickly or eventually discontinued for one reason or another. I was a regular on the trails in Indian Heaven Wilderness in southwest Washington, and at least once a year I would accomplish a grueling hike with my partner Reuben Hatch, and our favorite time was early to mid-September, with our treat the fantastic fall color of the native Vaccinium species. 12 altogether in Oregon and Washington, more than visually rewarding. The wilderness produces ripe huckleberries that are treasured by today's backpackers, and they were an important source of food for Native Americans since time immemorial. My favorite species for consumption was the aptly named Vaccinium deliciosum, and I would pop the tiny huckles into my mouth one at a time and savor the sweetness. While Reuben's method was to take longer to gather a handful and then stuff them down his pie hole. The ritual gave him goosebumps. We were two old geezers happy in berry heaven. Sadly, Reuben passed away a year ago, and I don't know if I'll ever return, as it would be an affront to his memory if I was to visit alone. Indian Heaven Wilderness comprises 20,784 acres on a forested plateau, 5,000 feet, dominated by Abies amabilis, Pacific silver fir, Abies Proera, noble fir, Abies lasicarpa, subulbine fir, and Tsuga mertensiana, mountain hemlock. One year, about 2004, as we drove near the trailhead, I spotted something white on a fir tree. I shouted for Reuben to stop and back up. He grumbled but did as instructed, for I had discovered a variegated portion on an Abies amabilis. It wasn't the ideal time to collect scions, but it was now or never, and surprisingly a couple grafts took. The subsequent propagules grew, but on each of them, the non-variegated portions dominated. So I was careful to propagate the variegated twigs only. I sold a small number of grafts for a couple years, but I soon concluded that the cultivar, which I named Indian Heaven, would not be predictably variegated, so I jumped off the wagon and discontinued production. Unsurprisingly, that situation is usually the case, that these glimmering promises don't pan out, and now regret selling any of them to anybody. In about 2010, as Reuben and I were exiting from a later Indian Heaven Berry Fest, I spotted a golden top on another Abies amabilis, and by then my friend knew the drill, namely pull over and let Buchholz harvest some scions, which I accomplished by jumping up to grab a golden branch, and with a Swiss Army knife, I procured my desired shoots. Again, when we propagate any discovery, it must be accompanied with a final identification name, and Indian Gold was my choice. Unfortunately, it was not stable either, and when the solid gold portions were propagated, the needles would burn in full sun. So, another strikeout that was discontinued, but perhaps a few Indian Heaven and Indian Gold still exist somewhere, though I don't grow either anymore. Okay, 0 for 2 so far, but a third Abies proved to be a mild commercial success. Abies Corana Nano. It is described in the RHS Encyclopedia of Conifers, a compact, narrow pyramid with outstanding violet cones produced at an early age. In 10 years, 180 by 120 centimeters, 6 by 4 foot. Introduced before 1991, Buchholz and Buchholz Nursery, Oregon, USA. That's right, it was produced before 1991, and I guess that date is based on the RHS author's first encounter with the cultivar. I collected scions from a compact Abies Corana at the Green Thumb Nursery in Nanaimo, Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada in about 1984, and I also came home with a couple of older stock plants. The late German owner, Gerhard Gerck, was a lover of unusual conifers, and we instantly bonded, probably because the old nurseryman was delighted to engage with anyone from the fatherland's diaspora. His compact selection was marked as merely Abies Proera, but I tagged it as Nanaimo because I was already collecting and propagating other cultivars of Abies Proera. Later, when I was able to visit various German nurseries in Europe, I discovered that the Dutchlanders' love of Abies Proera was quite evident, and that a number of cultivars and hybrids were popular in Euro gardens. The species tends to cone prolifically, especially on young trees that are spaded from the ground the previous winter. And equally exciting is that a number of blue foliage forms and dwarves from witches' brooms have been developed. Nanaimo City is a picturesque seaport on the southeastern coast of Vancouver Island and was called by the natives Sinimo for a gathering place for a big, strong tribe. Early in my career, I purchased a couple hundred seedlings of Abies Proera, our native noble fir, and I chose those sourced from a particularly blue-needled location. Out of the batch was one with exceptionally silver-blue foliage, and thus I coined the cultivar Silver. The species is highly esteemed in Western Oregon and Washington, but unfortunately does not fare well outside of its western haunts. Even though hardy to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, USDA Zone 5. So the nobles were a tough sell to my customers in Midwest and East Coast locations. I learned that reality the hard way, and I have shielded away from the species and its cultivars ever since. Abies Proera was introduced to Europe by botanist explorer David Douglas in 1825 under the name Abies nobilis. And indeed it is a most noble and stately fir, and is the tallest member in the world of Abies genus. Alfred Ritter of Arnold Arboretum in Boston changed the nobilis name in 1940 to Proera, which is Latin for tall, because the nobilis name was previously employed for another tree. In any case, the species is the preferred Christmas tree for the Buchholz family, and it surprises friends that I acquire a cut tree from a family farm. Since I grow so many trees yourself, why not just dig one from the nursery? Well, the harvested tree feeds a family that produced them for a specific purpose. And besides, the going rate for an 8 to 10-year-old Christmas tree noble is $60 to $80, and I'd be bankrupt if I invested a decade to produce a tree for so little. In Englishman K. Rutherford's Conifers is mention of Abies Proera forma glocka redder that covers the forms with good blue foliage and comes true from seed. I certainly take issue with the following statement. Selection of nursery plants for the blueness of foliage is better than grafting to obtain good foliage forms. Why is that better? Unless a seedling usually costs less than a grafted clone. The subjective better is not explained, but it belies the success of my entire horticultural career. Many years ago, I received scions, unsolicited, of Abies nordmanniana, witch's broom mutation. The box contained scrappy, congested 3-year shoots with slime and lichen on the stems. Yikes! I was poised to dump the contents, especially since I didn't even know the sender. I sighed, but I grafted a few anyway with the ID of Abies nordmanniana WB. 35 years later, a couple of the original grafts are grown in the Blue Forest section at the nursery, and they developed into compact buns that have grown into each other, and the entire green blob is about 6 foot tall by 7 foot wide. In about 2016, I changed the cultivar name from WB to Little Nordy. I grafted 50 or so and sold them as such. Cute name, but there's already competition with clones such as Brandt, Munsterland, and Nieder dwarves such as Hexenbess in Berlin and Petra. While I don't regret introducing Little Nordy, I do conclude that it was not a significant accomplishment. No word from the Scion sender either, and his name is lost to memory. Chamaecyparis obtusa lemon twist is a successful Buchholz introduction and features twisted, turning, thread-like golden foliage. Also, small curious fascinations occur on some branch tips. A Chamaecyparis obtusa Taurolusa dwarf, about 1994, which was itself a congested portion of the old Taurolusa, and lemon twist has never reverted back to green. Well done, Buchholz. A totally unique addition to the wonderful world of Hinocus. Or so I thought until I saw Satsumi Gold in Europe years later, and the two couldn't look more similar. The Satsumi Gold name is invalid, of course, as correct nomenclature insists that two languages cannot be used in a plant name, and you can just keep it in Europe. Anyway, we've grown many lemon twists over the years, and I think it's as good as any golden conifer. The original golden twig was grafted onto Thuja occidentalis smaragd, and after 29 years, it's a massive 12-foot tall and will require some side pruning to remain in the display garden. In 2012, I wrote, "Many growers want to find something special and name it, and I am no exception. However, I'll begin with a few of my mistakes. Chamaecyparis obtusa harumi, meaning spring beauty, was an early introduction. It showed great promise with its tiny twisted green foliage, much more dwarf than the above lemon twists, although both shared the same parentage, and the harumi also featured cream white specks to liven up the boring green. After its discovery 16 years ago, it is no longer in our production due to the fact that the green can dominate, and some portions of the plant will show sparse variegation. 8.5 years ago, I welcomed a new daughter, Harumi, and she turned out to be the winner, not my Hinoki. Not a good idea to name a plant after a family member. Another failure was Chamaecyparis obtusa Snow Blast, and I apologize for the couple of hundred that I sold at a small size without dutifully trialing it first. It originated as a fast-growing reversion from the very dwarf Chamaecyparis obtusus Snow-Kissed. Imagine a normal-sized green hinoki with white spots of variegation. At a smaller size, they were attractive, but eventually the growth habit became unruly and the variegation more sparse. The original propagule looked disgusting and was eventually edited from the landscape, and we haven't produced any more for the past 20 years. What accounts for the multitude of Chamaecyparis cultivars is the propensity of the species, actually the entire genus, to mutate. For example, when a branchlet changes colors or size or texture. You could call the Obtusa species itself unstable, and sometimes that is a good characteristic. Even a modest cypress hobbyist or producer would be blind if he ever discovered a foliage change and wonder what would happen if propagated. Now, just because you find a mutant branch and you or someone propagates it, that does not necessarily mean it will develop into a good garden-worthy cultivar. I know from experience, as I have wasted a lot of effort on my non-doers. Oftentimes, you just don't know unless you try, and then you're sometimes pleasantly surprised, but you usually are not. One example of that was Chamaecyparis obtusa Moonlight Lace, which originated as a fast-growing mutation on our introduction, Chamaecyparis obtusa Moonshine, detailed in Part 5. It didn't succeed, and can you guess why? For it fried during an early 100-degree Fahrenheit day, and thankfully we dropped it before any were sold. So not a Buchholz introduction. Cerus Lasiana Phils flurries didn't pan out either. It was discovered by employee Phil Terrell in about 2010 as a variegated mutation on the very dwarf Cerus Lasiana green globe. But the faster-growing cream-white portions of the flurries were prone to burn in our typical 100-degree Fahrenheit summers, even when grown with shade protection. So by the end of August, at least one-third of the plant would reveal unsightly brown twiglets, and we discontinued production with probably less than 100 plants totally sold. Again, I apologize, but we had a little fun with the Sesame Street-like character that sported the original mutation. While we produced a winner with Cerus Calotropsis or Xanthocerus nucantensis sparkling arrow, and a nice specimen is grown at the New York Botanic Garden, another variegated nucantensis discovery with golden splashes on the dark green foliage, called Fool's Gold, did not work out. It was discovered and named by the same employee/manager, Phil Terrell, who for over a dozen years cut nearly every scion that was propagated at Buchholz Nursery. You would describe Phil as the hands-on guy, as he had an intimate contact with the crops and found many things that others would pass by. I guess it was appropriate that he named his fineling Fool's Gold, because we were initially stirred up, but only to become disappointed later when the few numbers of grass that we produced would vary greatly in the amount of gold that developed. There was no mother lode to be had after all, and all that remains is a couple of scrawny containers in the forgotten corner of the distant greenhouse. Thanks for nothing. Another Cerus nucantensis cultivar, Mount Aldrich, was short-lived at Buchholz Nursery. It was introduced about 2012 with only a dozen plants ever produced. But I could see that there was no horticultural merit to the selection. It originated when I collected scions off of one tree in the Aldrich Mountains in central Oregon. Imagine my surprise when I learned of its disjunct population that occurs 150 miles away from its coastal brethren. Since I wondered if nucantensis really existed there, on a summer day, I excused myself from the nursery and drove 4 hours east into the arid sagebrush environment, hoping that I would be able to discover at least a few Alaska cedar specimens. I was pleased when the road led to a parking lot at a trailhead, where there was actually a U.S. Forest Service interpretive sign explaining that the 26-acre population has persisted since the Pleistocene, a leftover time when the climate was more wet and cool. I found some tall trees, none of them particularly attractive, but sadly most of the population was dead, even though other conifers were thriving. I was happy to find them, especially as they were easily seen along a well-groomed trail, but I was sweating at midday and constantly swatting mosquitoes that had just hatched after the recent snow melt. Let's just say it was a hurried affair when I stepped behind a tree to take a leak. For research purposes, I felt it would be okay to harvest a few scions, totally harmless, but I made sure nobody was watching. I grew the Mount Aldrich form for 8 years, but since the trees never looked ornamental, the last one was sold, and that ended the nucantensis chapter. Someone in Minnesota planted a Colorado blue spruce, Picea pungens, in their front yard, probably in the 1960s, but I doubt that anyone will ever know who germinated or raised the original seedling that was eventually grounded. At some point, nurseryman Gordon Bailey, or someone from his Bailey Nursery Company, noticed, or probably was stunned to see, that the new growth sported cream-white new shoots from the otherwise blue-green foliage. Mr. Bailey was allowed to harvest scionwood, and via his circuitous route he enlisted me in 1984 to propagate the discovery for his company. I agreed for 2 reasons. 1, my nursery was just beginning and I relished any business I could get. And 2, I was intrigued that a commonly grown, boring blue spruce could distinguish itself with such a fantastic spring bloom. Of course, I saved a few of the grass to grow on myself, so that I wouldn't have to rely on Bailey sending me scions, but I was forced to conclude that the selection was difficult to propagate, and it was a weak-growing tree anyway, or at least at my Oregon company. Nevertheless, the spruce was in need of a name since we both were growing propagules, and I proposed, and he agreed to Spring Ghost. Eventually, we decided to part ways with the spruce, that it wasn't going to succeed, and I don't think they ever continued with it. One of the original propagules is planted in my display garden, and at nearly 40 years of age, it is only 20% the size of a normal blue spruce. One explanation for its diminished size is the white shoots burn in Oregon summers, although the original tree in Minnesota reportedly does not. A former Buchholz employee dismissively wagged, "Spring Ghost, summer toast." At its best, Picea pungens Spring Ghost is a dazzling cultivar, but it has been superseded by better selections such as Picea pungens, Meagold, and Jebel's Golden Spring, and by the much stronger and well-shaped Picea glocka McConnell's Gold, also known as Mac Gold, with the latter never displaying golden new growth, but rather cream-white shoots like Spring Ghost. I still putter propagate Spring Ghost by grafting a flat of 25 every 4 to 5 years, for old time's sake, I suppose, as I still possess an urge to champion the weakling, and in hopes that it might thrive in someone else's garden even though it does not in mine. This blog has described my involvement with mildly successful to total failure introductions, and while I never seek or expect to discover the next most wonderful plant ever, I continue to grind at my profession in hopes it could happen. It's like me with 4-leaf clovers. I never intentionally look for them, but when I'm lucky, one will appear. And I've been very lucky.